Hi, boys and girls. Happy Monday. Hope you had a great weekend. Um, we are ready to move on with our studies of decimals. But before we start today's lesson, I thought that we would just do a quick recap of some of the work that we did last week. So I made this chart here, and I thought that before we even begin thinking about how to add decimals is to remember what our place values are when we talk about decimals. One of the first things that I want to remind you of is that a decimal is obviously less than a whole, and a decimal is another way to rename a fraction, another way to represent something that is, again, less than one whole. So I just made this chart here, and to remember that our decimal point is sort of that point where we can decide what is a whole number and what is a decimal. And I only went up to the hundredths place, but everything that's underlined in blue, anything to the left of the decimal, is a whole number. Okay, so we have our ones, our tens, and our hundreds. Okay, and to the right, we have our first decimal place, which is the tenths place, and then we have the hundredths, and then we have the thousands, and so on. Now, I always try to talk about how it's sort of a mirror image. Now, you might say, well, why aren't there ones on the right side if there's, tens, tenths, hundreds, hundreds? But remember, one is a whole. So the next value below that would be a tenth. Okay? So I'll keep a track of that chart. Perhaps I'll give you a copy of that so you can have that as a way to remember. The next thing I just want to remind us of is some of the ways that we can rename something. And a really helpful way to think of decimals is to think of money, okay? Especially when we're talking about decimals that are in the hundredths place. If we think of 1 cent, right, 1 penny, we're talking about the value of 1/100th of a dollar, right? Because there's 100 pennies in $1. So 1 cent would be 1/100th of a dollar. And aside from not putting the dollar sign, that's how we would write 1 cent, right? We would have the dollars here, our tens here, and there's our 1 penny. 10 cents could be 10 pennies or it could be a dime, is 10/100ths of a dollar, and we would write that as 10. Again, if I added a cent sign here, that's how it would look. But 1/10 or 10 hundredths, which brings us back to the point where we learned last week that, 1/10 is the same as 10 hundredths. Okay, it's the same thing, right? Just to jump ahead, if we had 30 cents, we'd have 30/100ths of a dollar, and that would be 30, or 3/100ths of a dollar, or 30 cents. And just to show you, it doesn't always have to be by tens. We have 35 cents, 35/100ths of a dollar, and that would be 3/3500ths. Okay, so just a quick review of just how we interpret a decimal. And we always read the number as it is, just like when we learned about periods in our standard form of numbers. We read that as 35. And because the 5 is in the hundredths place, we say that's 35 hundredths. If I go back to this one and I have 1 in the hundredths place, so it would be 1 hundredths. Okay? Just a quick review. So last week, and this is what's going to kind of get us into what today's lesson is. Last week, you worked on expanded form. An expanded form basically means breaking down a number into its specific or designated values. So if I showed you 1 and, again, we're going to read that as a whole number, 25 hundredths, because it's the 5 in the hundredths place, we could break that down into 1 whole, 2/10ths, and 5 hundredths. And one thing I want to note also is that this 500ths is not the same as that. Notice where that 0 is. That 0 is holding the place of what a tenth would be. And if I break this down, if I separate all that, that's only 500ths, where there's the 2. If I swapped it, I could put it right into that spot. Okay? And then I could do it the other way around. If I had 1, 4/10, and 7/100, our number would be 1, and wherever we say this is end. And we don't say 4/10 and 7/100, we say it's 47/100. Now this is the one I want to pay more close attention to, because I could also show it vertically. And one thing that I want you to notice is this 1 here. There's no decimal point. But when I'm adding decimals, especially with a whole number, I need to understand that in any whole number, there's a decimal to the right. It's imaginary. We don't typically write numbers with a decimal, but if we're working with decimals, we then need to rename that as in representation of a decimal. So 1 is the same as if we did 1.0000, we can go on forever. The 4/10, remember what we said, 4/10 is the same as 40/100. So there's my 4/10. I just put a 0 there to hold my place. And then I have my 7/100, and then I could add them up. 7/100, 4/10, and 1, and I get my number 1 and 47/100. Okay, so we're ready to move on for today? Let's keep in mind this particularly, because again, when we're adding whole numbers to decimals, we have to remember that that decimal then positions itself to the right of the whole number. So let's take a look. Should I have my paper ready? If I had, I'm going to use a 0 first. 0 and 7/10 I drank of a bottle of cranberry juice. And then I drank 2 more tenths. I think you could quickly realize that that would be that I drank 9/10 of juice. I'm going to show it to you this way. 0.7, or 0 and 7/10, and 0 and 2/10. I add up my tenths place. I include my decimal, and I have 0 whole ounces if I was working with ounces. Okay? I could also write it this way. 7/10 plus 2/10 equals, well, 7 and 2 equals 9/10. Now, one thing to remember is, if I add a tenth to this and I had 10/10, you need to know that 10/10 really is 1 whole. So let's keep that in mind when we're adding decimals that perhaps don't add up to less than 10/10. Here we have just 9/10, okay? Equally, if I had 7 ounces, 7/10 of juice left in the container, and I only drank 2/10, same thing. Well, if I had 7/10 and I drank 2/10, I'd be left with, everybody, 5/10. That's one way to write it. I could also write it this way, 0.7 minus 0.2, which equals 0.5, or 5/10, right? I could also write it this way. So one thing to note when you're adding or subtracting decimals is that you may have noticed the placement of the decimal is critical. Just like if you were adding whole numbers, you start in the ones place, you go to the tens place, you go to the hundreds place. Well, if you're working with decimals, you start with the tenths if that's the least or the smallest value. Equally, if I gave you 0.05, again, that would be 5, and it's in the hundreds place, so that would be 5 hundredths plus 3 hundredths. I could write it this way, 5 hundredths plus 3 hundredths. And you know what that's going to equal. 5 and 3 is going to equal 8 hundredths. So I could do it this way. Again, I'm going to start in my hundreds place because that's my first digit I'm going to work with. 5 and 3 is 8. No tenths and no whole numbers. So my answer is 8 hundredths. One thing to think about though is that it doesn't always end up that when we're adding tenths or hundreds that we're going to have a value that's less than 10 tenths or 10 hundredths. And so one thing to remember again is if we think of renaming decimals. Okay, so let's work on some of those. Actually, let's do this for right now, actually. If I have 3 and 5 tenths plus 6 and 2 tenths, okay, I know that I can add those up by looking at the values, knowing that I have tenths and 1 whole to add up. 3 and 5 tenths plus 6 and 2 tenths. I add them up. 7, 3 and 6 is 9, and we have 9 and 7 tenths. Well, let's say I have this, 3 and 9 tenths plus 2 tenths. Okay, so let's start with our 3 and 9 tenths. And my 2 tenths, it's going to go there. And right away you can see what's going to happen. I have more than 10 tenths here. So I'm going to have 1 tenth, and I'm going to regroup that 1, and I will have 4 and 1 tenth. Another way to look at that one is you might see that I only need 1 more tenth here to make that 4. So I could break this down into 1 tenth and 1 tenth, right? And I could bring one of those over here and make that 4 and add my 1, and I'm still going to get 4 and 1 tenth. Okay, so let's try one more. Actually, we'll do 2 more. We have 23 and 9 tenths plus 6 tenths. I'm going to take my 23 and 9 tenths. I'm going to add my 6 tenths. I know I'm going to be over 10 tenths here again, so I could do 5, 4, and 2. But again, if I show you it this way, you can see that this is 1 away from being 24. So maybe you saw this. That's 6/10 is really 1/10 and 5/10. We'll bring that right over here and make this 24 right away and add 5/10, and you're going to get 24 and 5/10. Okay. One last thing. What if I had 20, I don't know why I keep on working with 20, but we will keep doing that. What if I had 22 and 3/10? Sorry, guys. 22 and 3/10 plus 6. Not 6/10, not 6/100, just 6. Where would the decimal go? Remember what I said, that if I was adding whole numbers, we don't need to worry about that decimal, but because I'm working with a decimal, I need to see this as a decimal. So what in my mind, I'm thinking this is actually 6 point and as many zeros as I want. And knowing that, it's going to help me to line that up, because now I'm going to have 22 and 3/10. And now I know where that 6 should go. If you don't see that as a whole number, but converting it sort of to look as a decimal, you might think that that 6 belongs under the 3, but essentially that 6 belongs right here, 6.0. Okay, and we're going to add those up. 3, 8, and 2. 28 and 3/10. Let's try another one. 16 and 7/10 plus 4. Remember, it's a whole number. So I'm going to think in my mind that that's really 4. I'll just do 4.0 for now. So now I have 16 and 7/10 plus, right, 4. And that's going to be 7, 10, and become 20 and 7/10. Same thing would happen if we had hundreds, okay? If I had 800 plus 300, okay? Same thing, I'm gonna line them up. And actually I know that that's gonna equal even more, right? It's gonna become 1100. I could also do 800 plus 3. It's a whole number, but I'm going to know that if I'm dealing with decimals, I'm going to change this to also a decimal. And now I have 800 plus 3. And that's going to become 3/800. So your work today, boys and girls, is going to be to practice adding decimals, tenths and hundredths, and paying close attention to the fact that if you have a decimal that might, a whole number that might need to be converted into a decimal, you're going to be renaming, right? If you go greater than 9/10 and you rename it to another tenth or hundredth, okay, a whole number. And don't forget, let me go back to this. Okay, this decimal is our guide. Okay, anything, just like if we read a mixed number, our whole number and our fraction. Our numbers to the left are our whole number. Our numbers to the right are our decimals or our fractional pieces. And we have to remember that that decimal is always there, whether it's present on the paper or not. Okay, good luck today. You're going to work on pages 46 and 47. And you're going to do a combination of the things that I just shared with you today. Good luck, everybody.